we had a lot of people saying they wanted to come, and I was obviously because they're all fans of yours and GPS, and as a celebrity they want to come and meet you. But you know, what do you think about the interest there is right now for the stuff that you do? You know, how do you view the audience? Are they are they afraid of all the change that's happening? Are they happy with all the change that's happening? Are they curious? How do you maybe we can start by just talking about the audience right now. How are they viewing the stuff that you keep talking about?
Sure, because it's a very interesting question because it has changed and there is much greater interest. I think what's happened is we went through a period after the fall of the Berlin Wall when everybody thought they understood how the world was moving, and it was moving. Essentially, you were having kind of waves of liberalization, marketization, of trade, of technology, greater and greater openness of trade, technology, even of immigration, even liberalization of politics. I mean, if you think of the 1990s, you look at 1985, all of Latin America is run by juntas. By 1995, other than Cuba, they're all democracies. You look at Eastern Europe, obviously, in 1985, they're all communist countries. By 1995, they're all democracies. You think about Asia, big transformations in places like China and India economically. So there's these waves of liberalization taking place, and everybody thought this was the kind of natural expression of human aspiration. And all these trends, in a way, reinforced each other. So there was a master narrative that everyone understood. And what's happened over the last 5 or 7 years is people have realized that that master narrative is no longer applying. If you think about the last 7 years, every year over the last 7 years, there have been fewer democracies than the previous year. So there's a 7-year democratic recession. If you look at trade, we are now at the highest tariff levels around the world that we've had since the Great Depression, since the Smoot-Hawley tariffs of the 1930s. If you think about open technology, everywhere you are seeing data privacy, data control, concerns about national sovereignty. So the paradigm has shifted. And I think people can sense that the world that we were in and the narrative that was working is no longer working. What people don't know is where are we going now? Because it feels like a period of transition, but people are not sure transition to what. And as a result, each of these events, the Ukraine war, the violence in the Middle East, what China is doing in East Asia, take on a kind of larger and larger significance because people are wondering, okay, is this the new direction? In a sense, if you think about it in the terms of Francis Fukuyama, The End of History, people are trying to figure out what is the direction of history now?
And what is it? I mean, is it... No, but, I mean...
Sometimes people, when they ask me questions like this about the economy, I say, if I knew this, I wouldn't be sitting here. I'd be trading stocks, making sure that I was taking advantage of that direction. No, but it's a good question. Look...
I'll give it more pointed. Is it a trend of anti-incumbency or is it a trend of illiberal democracies? Because one of the things that I learned in my research for this interview was that you pointed out the trend of illiberal democracies in '97. Yeah. That's something nobody saw coming. So is it illiberal democracies or is it?
Yeah, and that's a very good way to think about it. So I think what's going on, and that's what my new book is about. What you are going through is essentially a very broad global backlash to the master narrative I was describing, and it is a backlash because I don't think we've ever seen that much revolutionary forward movement, if you want to think of it in terms of forward movement, open towards openness, towards, and even the kind of cultural revolution that took place, the rise of women in the workplace, the rise of gay, rights and things like that. All that has produced a backlash. And if you look at, just one thing, for example, the shift in the increasingly gendered nature of voting in the Western world. So it's happened in the United States, and I'm sure you've all heard about how women are now overwhelmingly voting for the Democrats and men for the Republicans. It's increasingly true in Europe. You're seeing a similar. So I think there's a very broad backlash, and I think it's not a spasm. What Trump's election showed was we are now in a period of backlash. Now, does that also mean a rise of illiberalism? I think that many of the forces of backlash are, they are also deeply anti-institutional. And, democracy is largely about institutions. A liberal democracy is about the institutions of free speech, not what the speech should be. It's the institution of elections, not who the victor should be. And so to the extent that people like Trump say, I don't care about these institutions. I want my people in power. I want them to do what I want them to do. It is anti-democratic, or at least illiberal in that form. And you see this in India as well, right? Like there's a certain tendency to say, if the judiciary is voting in a different direction, I'm not going to accept it. I'm going to manipulate the judiciary so it comes out the way I want. If the election commission tells me the elections have to be on certain dates, we're going to change the election commission. You have that illiberalism as part of the appeal of these strong men who say, I don't need to worry about all that. I'm getting you the result. But liberal democracy was always about process, not result.
So, just taking off from what you just said, that Trump's election, is he the biggest mascot of deglobalization? And his re-election, second term, gives a permission structure to societies across the world that this can be done. You can break down institutions and still get re-elected and not fear any backlash.
Yeah, I mean that's the worry, that it is a signal, and it gives a permission. And for better or worse, the U.S. has this very powerful symbolic effect around the world. I'll tell you, I don't know if this is true because everybody gets gossip in Delhi that everybody claims that they're one step away from the person who's one step away. But somebody told me that they were in a discussion with the highest level of people in Delhi, and somebody proposed to Modi that they liberalize on some set of tariffs, and he said, look at the Americans, they're raising tariffs, why should I lower tariffs? And you can sense that everywhere. People are saying, well, if the Americans are doing it. Now the sad thing is the United States can do this because 80% of the US market is a domestic market. It's a vast continental economy, and it's very free within it, so you get a lot of competition. But for India, the path to growth is going to be to integrate with the global economy. That is how China grew. India does not have a large enough domestic market of high-income consumers, of true global middle class that can drive the next phase of growth. 20 years from now, it may. But you can see even in China right now, the fact that, and remember, China is still 5 times the per capita GDP of India. When they are facing difficulty exporting, that is slowing down their growth enormously. So the irony is, you're exactly right, that people will take this permission structure. Politically, they'll be able to implement it because they can monkey with the judiciary, they can monkey with institutions. I mean, the stuff that Trump is doing with the Department of Justice is terrible because it will send a real signal that, the rule of law can be manipulated and things like that. But economically, it's very self-defeating for a country like India to put tariffs. And by the way, even for countries in Europe, trade is 20% of GDP in the US, roughly. I think it's 55 or 60% of trade of GDP in Germany. So the Germans can't live without exporting.
Yeah, I want you to unpack the US elections for us. In 2016, Trump didn't win the popular vote. This time, he's won the electoral college as well as the popular vote. Republicans will control the House and the Senate beginning next year. Supreme Court has a conservative majority. Now, all these are markers where we could see a much more sort of assertive, aggressive Trump 2.0. How does this sort of change or shape the political landscape of the US? How is it different from Trump 1.0?
So the simplest answer is Trump 1.0, he didn't expect him to win. I mean, all his people around him say that. And so they were surprised when they won. and they didn't have a plan as to how they were going to govern. So they inherited the Republican establishment. If you remember, the guy who becomes Trump's first chief of staff, his name is Reince Priebus. He was the head of the Republican National Committee. He was a guy Trump barely knew. So I hope this isn't my phone. If it is, I'll turn it off. But I don't think I have a Bollywood song going on in my phone. But if you think about his first Secretary of State was the former CEO of Exxon. He basically took on these Republican grandees as his cabinet and his key people.
And who he fired with a tweet.
Right, but what happened is, particularly, he loved generals then. If you remember, he appointed a general as chief of staff. He appointed generals, all kinds of places. And then he discovered that at the end of the day, these guys were more loyal to the country and the Constitution than to him. And I don't think I don't want to make it sound like he didn't want them to be loyal to the country and Constitution. We thought they should be loyal to him first. He had this view, wait a minute, I appointed you. You are meant to serve me. And if I tell you to do X, you are meant to do, X. So apparently his last defense secretary, he said, why don't we use troops to disperse these crowds? And the guy said, well, we can't use the American army on American citizens. So he said, well, just shoot them in the legs. And then when the guy said, no, I can't do that, and he resigned, Trump was puzzled. Like, I'm the commander-in-chief. I'm giving him an order. So now it's going to be all loyalists, people who, when confronted with those orders, try to find ways to make it happen rather than not to make it happen. Now, the U.S. still has lots of checks and balances, and there's a lot of legal constraints and institutional constraints, and you can't just do a lot of things that he wants to do. So it'll still be a struggle, but this time he won't have officials who are actively blocking him.
But your latest book is The Age of Revolution. So just would you call this revolution, or would you call this regime change? Trump.
I think this is, in a sense, counter-revolution. This is the backlash that I was describing. But it's a broader backlash than just Trump. Because I think the thing to understand, if you want to look at this election result, the most interesting thing about it is the realignment that you're seeing. So if you take the long view, okay, for the last 25 years, the US has had very close elections. Remember 2000, 536 votes in Florida, and the election would have gone in another direction, right? And in that whole period, there's only one real landslide, Obama in 2008. And that's really not just Obama, it was the financial crisis. And the fact that McCain seemed completely unable to comprehend what it was. So Obama gets this very large victory. Other than that, it's all close elections, all 1 or 2% of the popular vote, one way or the other. But the coalitions have flipped completely. In 1996, Bill Clinton won the non-college educated vote by 14 points. In 2024, Donald Trump won the non-college educated vote by 14 points. So the party, in 1996, the Republican Party was the party of the rich, the professionals, the upper middle class, and the Democratic Party was the party of the blue-collar worker and the working class. It has literally flipped. Bizarrely, still as tight as it was. The two coalitions are roughly similar, but they've just changed places. And that is the realignment that Trump saw that nobody else saw. In the primary of 2016, Trump was the only guy who was discordant from the other Republicans. The other Republicans were essentially repeating the kind of Ronald Reagan Chamber of Commerce ideology of the party, which is low taxes, low government spending, free markets, free trade, spread democracy abroad, the kind of Ronald Reagan formula. Trump was the only guy saying something completely different. He was saying, the Chinese are taking away your factories, the Mexicans are taking your jobs, the Muslims are trying to kill you, I'll beat them all up, you'll be great again. That was Trump's message in 4 sentences, right? And it was completely different. It was a message of cultural nationalism, protectionism, and he wiped the floor with those 16 Republican primary candidates. The election versus Clinton was a fluke, but the primary was not. He sensed that the party was in a different place. I've always thought that Trump was is incorrectly described as a bad businessman. He is a bad businessman, but he's a very good salesman. And a salesman understands what people want. And he must have, so obviously intuitive, he must have sensed in these crowds that what they want to hear is a completely different message than what people would. So there's this famous moment where he criticizes the Iraq war. And he realized that the working class base of the party were all the people who were going to fight and die and get injured in those wars. And so the last thing they wanted to hear was rah-rah nationalism about the wars. They had become deeply critical of this foreign adventurism and internationalism. So in that way, he's a very, very intuitive politician. And what he realized this time was that this working class base could be expanded beyond the white working class. And he reached out to Hispanics and blacks. And that's the big shift that takes place. There are two big shifts in this election. One really is the Hispanic working class that moves towards Trump. And the second is men. And that again, think about the way Trump campaigned. The Republican National Committee had as one of its key featured speakers, Hulk Hogan, ripping his shirt off. You remember that? And everyone thought this is Trump crazy, right? And again, you look at it and you think what he was signaling to a non-college educated working class man is, you're comfortable in our tent. And the Democrats, meanwhile, are talking about unisex bathrooms and trans sports, people being able to play in sports. And you can imagine, a Hispanic working class guy saying, no, I'm more comfortable in the party of Hulk Hogan than in the party of, gender-free this and gender-free that.
Is there some kind of a interesting similarity between the fact that a lot of women around the world, and I think even in India, support these strong men political leaders, and the fact that the working class support literally the definition of elite in America in terms of both Trump and Musk, and that combination. They literally are elite in every which way, right? I mean, even when they're not elected, they walk around with 30 bodyguards, and they literally are that top of the funnel elite. So is there something funny about that whole?
Yeah, I mean, so the second piece of it is, Trump, it's again a skill. Trump appeals to them because he tells them, not I am one of you, but I will represent you. I get you. And he's managed to do that. Why he's managed to do that, I don't know. I mean, he does come from Queens. He's kind of an ethnic guy from Queens made good. Trump is really a working class person's idea of what a rich person should be. He's if you look at photographs of Trump Tower, of his, triplex, it looks like a suite at a Las Vegas hotel. Right? It's like a lot of bling. It's the idea, it's the dazzle and razzle-dazzle of what it would be like. And he's very, I think, and it comes to him authentically. If you looked at, there was a photograph he released on Twitter yesterday in which he and Elon Musk and somebody else are on his plane eating McDonald's, right? So that's what some working class guy think, if I was really rich, I would buy a private plane, but I still love McDonald's, right? And so there's a sense in which he gets the way to communicate and symbolically say, I get you and I represent you. The women thing is I think more complicated. My mother always said, she was a working woman, and she said that working women present to non-working women a lot of non-working women regard working women as a kind of assault on their life choices. That what a working woman is saying symbolically to a non-working woman is, you made the wrong decisions in your life. You should not have lived your life as a housewife, as a mother. And so those women tend to be very hard on working women. And if you look at the feminist movement and Betty Friedan, there were a huge number of women, stay-at-home wives, mothers, who were very strongly opposed. There's a woman named Phyllis Schlafly who led this counterattack on feminism, which was very, very powerful. And I think that's still true, that there's a sense in which it's a very it does, you know, it does suggest, it's easy to say, well, people should do whatever they want, but a working woman is suggesting that there is a different role for a woman than the one that the non-working woman has chosen. And the non-working woman, I think, often views that as a threat or resents it or has a complicated relationship to it.
We need to get to Musk because that's one thing that I feel is everybody's interest in that. So just unpack that relationship for us. How did you see it start? How do you see it unfolding? How do you see it right now?
Look, I think at some level, I think it was a big kind of democratic mistake in that Trump was Musk was a Democrat. I mean, he was a big supporter of Obama's, and then he gets turned off. I think he gets turned off by the COVID and those work restrictions. He wanted his factories open, and the Democratic governor of California and all the Democrats in general were in favor of more restrictions, more lockdowns, more masks, and he was very turned off by that. I think it offended the kind of free market capitalist in him. And then apparently there's something with one of his kids is trans or identifies as that, and he worried that California law didn't give him enough a kind of authority to do something about that. I have not followed that part of it very closely, but something happened with Trump, and then the Democrats frankly treated him badly. Biden had an auto summit, an EV summit, at which they didn't invite Elon Musk, which is kind of crazy, right? I mean, this is the guy who invented the EV, and he gave a speech at it saying General Motors is the pioneer of electric vehicles in America. So, and Musk tweeted that day, when you make an enemy of me, it's a bad idea or something like that. It was so the whole thing, I think, was handled badly. There's an element of it which is, if you push him away, yes. I think at some point he realized that he could jump onto the Trump bandwagon, make a big difference, get close to Trump. Maybe he also thinks Trump is a fascinating character. I don't know, but he's a very smart guy, and I think strategically he realized, look, I can get very close to this guy. I can be very influential. And I think that in my own view, he also knows that he needs the US government to help him deal with one huge issue he has, which is China. Remember, Tesla needs the Chinese market and the US market to justify its market cap. And he'll need to be part of some kind of deal that they are going to broker. So I think that a lot of it is Musk getting turned off from the Democrats, looking around, finding Trump to be, as late as 2022, he was tweeting this guy, about Trump, this guy should drop out, why is he running again, it's bad for America. So at some point he decided, you know what, I'll jump on this bandwagon and it'll work out for me.
The conflict of interest, this proximity to the government, he's such a, has such a lot of contract business from the government. So his voters care for that? Or?
I mean, that's the magic of Trump. They don't seem to care about any of that.
To the extent he's sitting in a call with Zelensky, he's meeting foreign ministers.
Look, his share price went up 30% in 2 days after Trump was elected. There's nothing economically that's changed about Tesla in 2 days. In fact, if anything, the party in power is more anti-green technology and EVs than it was before. So, I mean, this is you'd expect Adani stock to go up after Modi wins, but not in America, right? So it feels like a very odd thing to happen in the world's leading free market country.
And there are a lot of China hawks in his cabinet, but Trump needs China. I mean, to the extent that he stood up our prime minister, allegedly because somebody in China said, not now. Now's not the time for you to go visit India.
That's Musk, right?
Yeah, sorry, did I say Trump? Sorry, I meant Musk.
Yeah. No, Musk definitely needs China. I mean, he needs some kind of a deal because the Chinese can easily say, you can't, as an American company, be doing all this data collection using your EVs about where Chinese people live and move or travel. Like, that's all stuff that is, I think it's actually a violation of current Chinese law. So they'll have to make some exception for him. So there's a big upside for for Musk in having some kind of US-China deal.
So since we are on China and the strategic competition between US and China really sort of was dominated Trump's 1.0. I mean, Trump was the first US president to publicly describe, label China as a strategic threat, rival the national security strategy in 2017. But 4 years down the line, it's a different China that we're dealing with, which Trump 2.0 will have, and it has packed the cabinet, he has packed with China hawks, the cabinet appointments that we see, NSA or the Secretary of State, they're yet to be confirmed, but they are his picks. So what does it signal to China? And I come from a point where I was in China for a week, I came back 2 days back, and the sense I got in my meetings in the government, in business, party, as well as the general society, was that the Chinese, there was one guy who said that, if you support us, if you're friends with us, we'll be friends with you. But if you don't support us, we don't care. So we can handle the US. So they spoke a much more confident tone of handling, one of them called a Trump shock. So how do you see Trump's appointments and Musk now intersecting and handling of China? How does that play out now?
No, I think you're right. The Chinese seem to, under Xi Jinping, have almost wanted a confrontational relationship with the United States. Remember, when Xi comes in, there was that summit at Sunnylands between him and Obama. And he promises Obama that the Chinese will not build a base in the South China Sea. And then they do. So he lies to Obama to his face. And then he tells Obama that they will stop the cyber espionage that's going on. And again, they don't. They do for a year and then they pick up again. So there's a sense in which the Chinese had begun to move to a much more hawkish, confrontational, nationalist position. And then, of course, they economically begin the pulling away from the US. So Xi Jinping gives this major speech, Made in China, which is, by the way, what Modi then adopted as the Made in India. She gave that speech in 2015, before Trump was elected. I think it was even before Trump was running. So the Chinese have been moving in this direction. And I think Xi wants, as part of his, nationalism, it allows him to assert the Communist Party's control. It allows him to build larger military budgets. It justifies the wolf warrior diplomacy to say we are in a fundamentally adversarial position with the US, which is trying to contain us. We have to be hawkish about it. Think about people like Putin and Xi. We always look at them with a little bit of this puzzlement of why are they doing these things that are not good for their general economy and, openness and trade, and that's not how they think. Xi Jinping's nightmare is the opening that Gorbachev did in the Soviet Union, with the Glasnost and Perestroika, which destroyed the Soviet Communist Party. And there's a very good, Kevin Rudd has written a wonderful book, the former Prime Minister of Australia. He went in, after his prime ministership, he went and got a PhD at Oxford, studying the thought of Xi Jinping. And what he points out is Xi Jinping's nightmare is Gorbachev, that China was opening up, and what was going to happen is the Communist Party was going to collapse into irrelevance. So in that, if you think from that mindset, having a tough US administration is actually fine. They'll negotiate trade deals with them, they'll negotiate security deals with them, but all from the position of this adversarial competition.
Right. And, because Trump's in his campaign, and even in his previous administration, he had imposed tariffs. At this time, he's talked about across the board 10% tariffs for all US imports. And that is, while it might be hurting China most and EU, but India would also be impacted with that. How do you think that will play out in India? And with India-US relationship, will that be the biggest stress test?
So there is a golden opportunity here for India. Trump has set 10% tariffs across the board, 60% on China. My guess is the part he really means is, don't worry about the numbers, that China will be particularly hit hard by tariffs, but everybody else will face them. If you know Trump, you have to assume that this is a bargaining position. This is a kind of opening salvo. And so what India could do is try to negotiate a bilateral trade deal with Trump. And the reason I say it's a golden opportunity is because you can create a much greater sense of regularity, you can create a corridor for US-India trade, and if India has to, as a result, reduce some of its tariffs, this is actually very good for the Indian economy. The tariffs that India has in place, India is the most protectionist large economy in the world. Most of the protectionism India has in place is entirely because large Indian companies, conglomerates, and industrials do not want competition. There is a 400% tariff the last time I checked on imported wines, beers, liquor. Right? That is not because you're trying to grow a local industry, in India. India, as you know, India has very complicated attitudes towards alcohol. There are some places that are dry. No, it's because there's a very large company in India that does not want competition. And that is the typical, rationale behind a lot of the protectionism in India. So if the Trump threat forces India to open up some of its markets, and in return it gets some greater access to US technology that it has not had so far, that could be a very important win for India. And, Trump likes making these deals. I think the age of multilateral trade is over. What you're going to have is these bilateral trade deals, and India could be positioned to do a good one. And by the way, if it is competing for the US market against a China that has 60% tariffs, it's going to be in a better position.
While that's true, I mean, I agree with the bilateral thing, and I think Indian authorities are also thinking on those lines. But you talk about an axis that's kind of been formed, which is a very strong one, between China, Iran, North Korea, and Russia. Can that be ignored in these bilaterals? Can that be set aside while we talk bilaterals?
Yeah, I mean, don't forget that when you look at the United States and its broader ecosystem, the European Union, the US, Japan, Korea, Australia, Singapore, that's 65% of global GDP. That's still, by the way, 80% of global military spending. And it's 90% of global technology, I mean, so I think that China is the only piece of that alliance that is economically vibrant. I mean, Russia is essentially, a basket case. Iran is a basket case. North Korea, it doesn't really exist in the world economy. So it's an alliance of troublemakers. But there's only China there that is economically vibrant. The rest of it are spoiler states that can cause trouble, but they can't offer a compelling alternative or a value proposition to any country that's looking from the global south.
Sure. The troublemakers, the axis of troublemakers, can we spend some time on that? Because you wrote a piece saying that this is actually the most dangerous time in the world, given this axis coming there. So just spend some time on that.
Yeah, because what is happening is that this axis is trying to upend, or at least erode, the existing international security framework, which is largely one created by the United States after World War II. The UN-based system, Bretton Woods economy, the norms that have been put in place around no acquisition of territory by force. And most people will be surprised to realize that those norms have largely held. Yes, there are some exceptions to them, but in many of those cases, the status of that territory has never been legitimized. So you think about POK, you think about Israel's acquisition of territories after '67. It's not like in the pre-1945 world, this was routine. Country A would invade country B, grab its territory, become part of it. It's an extraordinary victory for international law, in a sense, that people do not regard that as normal, and that the Russian invasion of Ukraine, therefore, is regarded as very abnormal. But all these four countries are all in their own way trying to erode that system. Right? The Russians and each one using what power they have. The Russians through classic conventional military aggression. The Iranians, through this asymmetrical power, use of these proxy militias from the Houthis lobbing missiles and drones, which have diverted, by the way, 70% of the commercial traffic out of the Persian Gulf. It has to go all the way around Africa, which adds 13 days to the trip. Very good for Indian shipping companies, by the way. You look at what the Chinese are doing through economic power, slowly trying to replace the United States as the kind of leading player. And the North Koreans, with their nuclear arsenal, each one is using the power that they have, but they're all working in the same way to kind of erode this order. And what makes it dangerous is, what you need, therefore, is a concerted, unified, purposeful, strategic response from the countries that want to maintain this system, that want order and stability and an open economy and all that. And that's hard, because you require the US and you require all these democracies to coordinate policy, which is not something they naturally do. It requires them to act in a kind of aggressive, purposeful manner, which they're not. It's a much harder sell. The Iranian mullahs and the Russians and the Chinese and the North Koreans don't have to consult their public. They can just do all this.
But India's friends with pretty much everyone right now.
Yeah, look, the Indians have been trying to play this game of multi-aligned foreign policy, and India is in the catbird seat, and it does have the ability to align itself or do business with whomever it wants without incurring the kind of punishments that would usually come with that, so that they can deal with the Russians on the military areas, but the Americans won't, admonish them or punish them the way they would.
Well, I think they did try at some point, and they gave up trying. Right?
They've always sort of said to them, we don't think this is this is the best thing, from our point of view. But the Americans have been very understanding of India's foreign policy. My own view has always been, this is a mistake, that India is the world's largest democracy. It is a country deeply defined by its pluralism, by its values, in a sense. And from a strategic and political and moral point of view, it will gain much more for itself by aligning itself firmly with the forces of democracy and liberalism and openness, because the only way India is really going to grow economically is if it has a very close relationship with the most advanced centers of economics and technology in the world, and those are in the West. And it has a natural affinity and a connection to them. Remember, India is $2,700 per capita GDP. The United States is what, $65,000 per capita GDP. India has a long way to go. It has none of the kind of technology companies that China has, let alone the US. India needs to move up the technological frontier. It needs to move up the education frontier. It needs to find a way to collaborate in the new global supply chains. All of that is much more likely to happen with the West. You think the Chinese are going to let the Indians integrate into a Chinese global supply chain? It's never going to happen. The Russians don't have a high-tech global supply chain. So from a completely self-interested point of view, India should stop playing this game of playing footsie with everyone, and instead say proudly and loudly, we're a democracy, we are part of an open world, we want a world of openness, stability, we believe in the values and norms that define this world, and it will gain economically, it will gain politically, and it's exactly the right expression. But there is a tendency in India, which is a kind of strange combination of old Nehruvian anti-colonialism, BJP's old, kind of national protectionism and cultural conservatism, and a kind of opportunism that says, we can get away with this. Yes, you can get away with it, but is it the best strategic direction for India for the next 40, 50 years? I would say no.
I'll just push back a little bit on that, and then Shubhaji take over and get into the more technical stuff. But America, for instance, has done exactly what India's kind of doing. I mean, the democracy part of it never held America back from having relationships with undemocratic countries. Isn't it wise for India to try to do all of it, to try to exploit the economic part of it with America and with the West, while having relations with Russia? Because, America hasn't exactly been a friend that it can count on. I mean, we keep seeing successively, every new government says we're more transactional with India than it was earlier. Now, of course, it's a little bit different. That now there's a bipartisan support for India in the US. But you think India can bet and fully just back American relationship?
Well, remember, the Cold War is a different era, and that world is gone. But since the Cold War, look at American policy toward India. People often say the US vacillates and, moves back and forth and it's volatile, but it's completely untrue. The US stayed firm for 45 years during the Cold War, while everybody else, when it was fighting Islamic terrorism, I remember the phrase, you will remember from your Afghanistan days, the Taliban used to say, you may have the watches, but we have the time. Meaning, you guys are fickle and you change and we are unchanging. Well, who's doing well now? The Taliban or the United States, right? The US stayed in Afghanistan for 20 years. By the way, just 2.5 times as long as the Soviet dictatorship did. The US has much more staying power than people realize. And since the Cold War, the US has been consistently and progressively pro-Indian. The Clinton administration began the change. The Bush administration with the nuclear deal made the fundamental break. The Obama administration, Obama used to say Prime Minister Manmohan Singh is the man in the world I admire the most. Then you get Trump, who loves Modi. Then you get Biden, and they have had a much closer strategic partnership under Biden than even they had under Trump, and now we're back with Trump. It is a one-way direction, and by the way, the US has given India whatever it wanted. And let me remind you, by the way, if you're talking about Modi said multi-aligned foreign policy at a time when what he was actually referring to, if you look at Indian foreign policy and where he was going and whom he was meeting, where he was trying to have a much closer relationship with China. It was when he was meeting with Modi 1, 2, 3, when he was meeting with Xi 2, 3, 4, 5 times. How well did that work out? To me, that whole experience is actually very reminiscent of Nehru in the 50s and 60s, talking about Hindu Chini bhai bhai, and then waking up one morning to discover, oops, the Chinese are at our border. And it's exactly what happened to Modi in the same border.
So, since we are in US policy being bipartisan, as you indicated, last 5 US presidents, starting from Clinton onwards till Biden, and Trump is expected to continue the strengthening of India-US relationship. But referencing China, is China the strategic glue for the India-US relationship?
Yes, to a certain extent, China is the strategic glue, but there is also a value-based glue that India and America share deep values. Look, this is an area where I just want the governments to catch up with the people. India is the most pro-American country in the world. This is not my opinion. If you look at opinion expression of America, that's higher now than even Israel. That's higher than Poland, which were the other two. So, this is a case where, and it's always, largely been true. Krishna Menon would go to the UN and make these fiery speeches denouncing, America, while meanwhile, every Indian is trying to get a visa to go to an American college. Right? Like there's this strange disconnect that still takes place by the so clever, wise, foreign policy elite at the MEA who are like navigating this and quietly, cozying up to the Russians. The Indian people don't do that. Like there's nobody lining up to go to Beijing and Moscow. And by the way, what have you gotten from that? You have Russian kit in the Indian military. Look at how well it's doing anywhere in the world. Look at what happened in Iran. In a few hours, the Israeli Air Force was able to destroy all of Iran's defenses. You know who built them? The Russians. You want that kit compared with the most advanced military kit in the world that you could get from the West? Why? It's not in India's self-interest.
No, because a lot of that American kit lands up in Pakistan. So that's one of the things that holds India back.
Again, as I said, the Cold War was the Cold War. And we can relitigate whose fault it was that India ended up choosing, siding with the Soviet Union. I will simply point out, however it happened, it chose the losing side. Do you want to do that twice?
But is Pakistan a factor?
Pakistan has now become irrelevant in the Indian context. India is so much larger. India should be thinking about itself as a global strategic player, not as a regional player. And to the extent that it has there is a strategic dynamic it should be thinking about, it's the China dynamic that should be important. Pakistan has essentially become a Chinese client state at this point. So Pakistan is relevant, but it's only relevant because now it has the pretty much wholehearted support of China, and that allows China to, in a kind of almost asymmetrical way, activate Pakistan and through Pakistan militants in POK to do some kind of stuff. So you have to worry about that in terms of your relationship with China. Can the Chinese use Pakistan as a way to destabilize India? So again, all the more reason, it seems to me, to be conscious of that reality.
We talked about the continuity in the India-US relationship, but with Trump, there's an element of unpredictability that's built in Trumpism, in Trump administration. But the Indian government so far in its public statements, public articulation, and I will quote External Affairs Minister Jaishankar, who said last Sunday here in Bombay that I know today a lot of countries are nervous about the US. Let's be honest about it, we are not one of them. So essentially saying that we are Trump-proof. Is India confident? Is its confidence misplaced, or is it actually Trump-proof?
No, I think Jaishankar is right. Trump has always had a favorable attitude towards India. He's also, by the way, always had a favorable attitude towards the BJP and towards Modi. So they're in a good position at multiple levels. He will press them on trade, but as I said, there's a trade deal to be had. I think Jaishankar has pretty accurately summarized the situation.
Immigration has been a sort of a hot button issue during the election campaign. It's like one of the two or three things that you have also marked out in your column post the election outcome. India sends skilled professionals every year. 270,000 Indian students have got there last year. So this legal immigration versus illegal immigration, this has been a challenge even from the Indian government side. And the Indian government has never sort of advocated for illegal immigration. In the last 1 year, data shows about 1,100 Indians were deported by the Biden administration on planes. If Trump administration now takes it a step forward, makes it a public spectacle of sending back Indians in plane loads, what does it mean? What does it do to the India-US relationship?
I honestly think it can weather those deportations because, as you point out, Indians largely go to America legally. What you're talking about is the whole H-1 student visas, all that stuff. Still in the United States, despite all the reaction to immigration, which, as I say, I think is largely justified because you've had millions and millions of people going to the border illegally, gaming the asylum system, saying that they were politically persecuted or some version of that, and therefore getting a kind of legal entry into the U.S., in my opinion, completely gaming the old system. And people should be outraged. You've had millions and millions of people doing this, and the system is no longer working. The asylum system no longer works. That is quite separate from the issue of immigration, whether we have the right numbers. Broadly speaking, I'd say in America, there's still a fair degree of support for legal immigration, though unfortunately it has decreased because of this rise of asylum seeking and the crisis on the border. But I think if that problem is taken care of, and if you really crack down and I think just shut down the old asylum system, I think you'll find that support for legal immigration will rise again. There is, in the United States, I think most people understand you do need a certain amount of legal immigration, which, by the way, we still do it, it's very generous legal immigration policy. We've taken 1 million legal immigrants a year, which is more than, just to give you a point of comparison, it's more than all rich industrialized countries put together. Legal immigrants, and remember, an American legal immigrant has a pathway to citizenship, which is very unusual compared to others. You know, like the Germans have a blue card or something like that, but the last I checked, you can't turn it into German citizenship. You know, you're forever a non-voting permanent resident, whereas the American system really, it sort of accepts you into the country in a way that's very different. So I think it's a storm that can be weathered. There will be some complications around it. I think that the Trump people, for example, don't like the way the H1 system gets gamed a certain amount by companies and things like that. But those are, I think, relatively small issues. And again, the thing with Trump is you can always do a deal as long as you are willing to engage and let him say he won. You know, and I mean, this is what the Canadians told me when they negotiated the revision of NAFTA, which was, you know, you have to be willing to, basically, he'll go out and make a press conference saying, I did an amazing deal, it's great for the American people, and you just wait and don't contradict it and say, no, it's actually a better deal for the Canadians, and then you're fine.
We haven't gotten to the wars yet, so we could quickly spend a minute on that, and we'll do a quick rapid fire. Actually, it's not a quick rapid fire. I got too many questions. I tried to make it as short as I could, but we'll do rapid fire, and then we'll get to some audience questions. But just a bit about, you know, Trump said he'll resolve Ukraine before
inauguration day. He said that he wants to, I mean, and his relationship with Putin, Zelensky flaunts about it. It touts about his sort of chemistry that he has. And so what does it mean for the war, which has been on now for more than 2.5 years? And Ukraine will he sell out Ukraine? Will US stop supporting Ukraine?
Yeah, I mean, that is certainly a real risk. And if I were Ukrainian, I would be very worried right now, because Trump, you know, his vice president presented a peace plan that was essentially Vladimir Putin's peace plan. You would have to be very nervous. You remember in the first term, he tried to blackmail the president of Ukraine, and don't forget, the president didn't get blackmailed. So they don't have great relations. He does have this strange admiration for Putin. So if you look at it all, it doesn't look great for Ukraine. There's a possibility that it provides a pathway, which is an interesting and intriguing one, which is, you know, at this point, neither side is going to move much. The lines look pretty set in Ukraine. If there's a way to stop the war and make a deal, and the deal would be simple, which is the Russians can keep the 20% of Ukraine they have. In return, Ukraine gets some security guarantees from the West, and the war stops. But the Ukrainians have to get some security guarantees, because otherwise the Russians will just wait and, you know, take a second bite at the apple in a year, 2 years, 5 years from now. And by the way, who's going to invest in Ukraine under those circumstances where you don't know whether the Russians are coming back? So Ukraine would collapse. So there's a deal, but Trump has to view it as a deal where he's actually pushing both sides to make concessions.
So you went to Ukraine, I think September? Yeah, and interviewed Zelensky. What is the sense you got, the fear that he has if a Trump win came through?
Oh, look, he was clearly apprehensive. He tried to put on a brave face about it, but he was clearly apprehensive. There was a part of him that thought, you know, maybe they're frustrated. The war is not going well. It's not going that well for the Russians either. It's a kind of very bloody stalemate. But, you know, there's a part of him that thought maybe there's a chance that Trump will want to make this deal and realize that in order to do it, you have to put more pressure on the Russians. You know, I don't see that in much of Trump's rhetoric. You know, he's never been willing to even condemn the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But look, what the Ukrainians have to do is try to find some silver lining, right? And so the silver lining is, maybe if Trump says, I want to end this war, I want to do a deal, he realized that the deal can't be to sell out Ukraine. The deal has to be to stabilize the situation. And in that context, it could give Zelensky a way of going to his people and saying, look, I had to accept this, because otherwise Trump was going to stop sending us weapons, right? You know, there's a problem in a democracy. For Zelensky has to be able to sell the deal to his people. Putin doesn't have to worry about that. And Zelensky has a hard job, which in every democracy you have, which is, was it worth it? You know, you've spent all this money, and you've, more importantly, the blood of your young Ukrainians, and you have to justify that. And what could justify it for the Ukrainians is say, we are now allowed to be a free, democratic, sovereign nation anchored in the West, economically through the European Union, militarily through NATO. This was our goal, right? The specific configuration of our territory was not, that's not as important as the fact that we are now, bona fide members of the West.
There was a missile attack yesterday that I was reading about. I was surprised about that, because I thought, at least now after Trump and Biden had to approve of that, right?
Biden had to approve of the use of Ukrainian weapons into Russia.
Which he did. Yes.
Which he did. Look, I think that I think that there is a tendency to view what Biden is doing as too cautious. He's giving the Ukrainians aid, but not allowing them to strike deep into Russia. I think it's a reasonable concern. The Biden administration has had two goals. The first has been to support Ukraine, to repel Russian aggression, to make Russia pay a very heavy price for this aggression. And the second is to not allow this to escalate into a war between Russia and NATO, which then could go nuclear. That seems to me like a legitimate, concern number two seems to me a legitimate concern, and it seems a little irresponsible for people to say, oh, don't worry, just have a big free-for-all, let these things go wherever they go. If you're the president of the United States and you're facing a nuclear, remember, Russia has the largest nuclear arsenal in the world. It seems to me legitimate to be trying to draw some lines and saying, we don't want to send. By the way, Putin has repeatedly said that he regards that as a line, as a red line, and don't cross it. So, it seems to me there is, in some areas, I think the Biden people could have been more, could have gotten weaponry and stuff faster to the Ukrainians. But on this issue, I think it is legitimate to be balancing these two goals, goal one and goal two.
Europe has been especially worried about a Trump 2.0, and it's not secret. I've traveled across Europe, Germany, Norway, UK, and they have all been sort of very apprehensive about whether Trump will sort of undo NATO finally in his second term. You think that's a possibility?
Well, it's definitely a possibility, and I don't think it's a possibility in the sense of him formally withdrawing from NATO, which, by the way, the US Congress, with the Republican House, passed a resolution saying that the United States president cannot withdraw from NATO without congressional approval. So there's now a mechanism for withdrawal from NATO that requires Congress be involved in it. But I think what he could do, which is probably as effective, if not more so, is simply say, I'm not going to defend Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania if they get attacked by the Russians. I don't see how that's a threat to the United States. Because, the core of NATO has always been the promise that the United States would come to the defense of Europe. And that does lie in the purview of the president. So you can have NATO, you continue to have all the buildings, you continue to have all the meetings, ministerials, but if you take that, if you express doubts about that, you're taking the heart of NATO away. And after all, that's what Putin is looking at, not how many times they meet in committee meetings in Brussels. What he's looking at is the US president going to come to the assistance of Europe. And what does Europe mean? If I intimidate Lithuania and Latvia and Estonia, which that was part of the Soviet Empire, it's basically neighborhoods of St. Petersburg, very, very close to the Russians. We intimidate them, will the Americans stand up? And it's always been a very, it's an extraordinary act of extended deterrence that the United States provides for the world by saying, no, we will come to the aid of, tiny Latvia and Lithuania. And if Trump just says, I don't think so.
What's in it for me?
In a sense, that's the end of NATO.
So if US cedes leadership role, who do you think can step in?
Nobody. That's part of the big challenge, and part of I think the reason that Trump's victory is much more disturbing to me at an international level than at a domestic level is because there is no alternative to American leadership. And for all those people in the world who, criticize and denigrate American leadership, even if I agree with various specific criticisms they may have, they're going to see, we might run in that experiment and see what a world looks like without American leadership. And it's not going to be pretty. It's going to be a lot of freelancing. It's going to be a lot of small taking, the big taking advantage of the small, the strong taking advantage of the weak, bilateral deals, freelancing diplomacy, and all of these rules and norms that have prevailed for 75 years now will start eroding very rapidly. I think the world will look back historically and see, the United States, just take something like foreign aid. Before World War II, there was virtually zero foreign aid given by the rich countries in the world to the poor countries. Today, there are tsunamis of money that go across the world from the rich countries to the poor countries. That is a change in norms fundamentally affected by the United States, which had a huge impact on the rest of the world. The Green Revolution would not have taken place in India without that kind of thing, right? And I don't see the Chinese doing that. They're building, they're building out their Belt and Road Initiative, but that's all about infrastructure. That's not about this general effort, And I think that I think Americans don't realize it, and the rest of the world don't realize it. But the U.S. has fundamentally had a very benign effect on the world. It has done lots of things bad and has made lots of mistakes, and those can be criticized. But I think people sometimes forget that larger picture.
Obvious fishing here, but can't India somewhere step up?
Look, India is, first of all...
I know the economy is much smaller, I get that.
And that matters in the world, power matters. So the first thing is...
Moral authority?
Well...
The fact that we have friendship with Iran, Russia, China, not China, but China as of last week a little bit, but America, all of it together?
Well, it gives you bargaining power, and I think it gives you some, it gives you a role for sure. But, and by the way, I think, for example, India could play an interesting role on the Ukraine issue because it has good relations with Russia and the US. So partly there's an issue of, does India want to play that role? India is historically, actually, for the most part, despite all the self-righteousness of its rhetoric in the UN, it's been very reluctant to get involved in the world. It's had a very narrow set of interests. If you think of Indian foreign policy, it's largely been directed towards Pakistan, to a certain extent, Bangladesh, to a certain extent, Sri Lanka. Very little else, and even China, before the Himalaya incursion, most Indians didn't care about China. If you looked at the polls, so partly it would require an Indian change in mentality to say we want to play this larger role consistent with our values, but partly there is a limitation in terms of power. As I think, I hope I'm not quoting something he wouldn't want me to quote, but Montek Singh Ahluwalia once told me, the fundamental thing Indians should realize is if they want to have an impact on the world, grow your GDP. If you become a major power, you will have an impact on the world. Look at China.
I think let's get to the rapid fire, and then we come back and talk about Israel, because that's something we kind of haven't gotten to yet, but I do want to get to rapid fire first. All right, Fareed, you know the format. Just have fun with the answers. I've got a lot of questions. I should have less, but I really couldn't. So have fun and try to keep the answers a little bit short. And have fun. If you get a call from Trump to join his cabinet, do you accept it?
No.
Why?
I just don't respect him as a human being. For me, it's a matter of character. I mean, he just embodies a certain set of values that I wouldn't want my son to grow up emulating, and I would find it very hard to justify, being willing to do that. It's not even about policy. Policy one can make adjustments, but character is very hard to adjust.
Will NATO survive 4 years, yes or no?
Yes.
On a scale of 1 to 10, define the relevance of the UN in 2024.
Can I go negative on the scale?
Who's more powerful today, Elon Musk or Bill Gates?
Oh, Elon Musk. Elon Musk may be the most powerful private individual in American history.
Okay. And will he likely to remain so in 2028?
I think so, yeah.
Okay.
I mean, unless he and Trump have a fight, they are both famously volatile people.
Yes.
And so, there may be a kind of lover's tiff.
There's the cabinet appointments when they started coming through. I did some research, and it turned out that the first Trump 1.0, the average tenure size term was 1.8 years for secretary level, and in Trump had 4 national security advisors, including one who didn't even last 2 months. So that tells you so what does this tell you about the cabinet appointments?
I think that was Trump 1. I think at this point he has a much more, he has people who will salute and do what he tells them. So I think you'll have a longer tenure. The shortest, by the way, was of course Anthony Scaramucci, who I think was 18 days or something like that. I think he competes with Liz Truss as Prime Minister of the UK for shortest tenure of an important public figure.
Okay, back to rapid fire. Fareed, you did your PhD from Harvard under Professor Samuel Huntington. If you were to do a PhD today, what would the subject be?
I still love what I did, American foreign policy, international relations. The logical answer should be artificial intelligence, since everybody now wants to get into artificial intelligence, even though most people don't even know what it means.
Okay. Fareed, which country do you bet on to win the chip wars, if there is one winner?
The US, without any question.
What's the number one real fear of a Trump presidency and the number one imagined fear of a Trump presidency?
That's tough. My number one fear is the withdrawal, the broader withdrawal from the world, and the kind of lack of the turning in of the generosity of America towards the world. The US has always had this attitude that, we can have a peaceful world in which we do well by allowing others to do well as well, rather than a kind of Banya-like attitude that says we're going to squeeze everybody else as much as we can. The number one imagined fear, I think the dictatorship idea and the words like dictator and fascist, I think, are thrown around much too loosely. And I think the US has very strong democratic institutions that make that unlikely.
Okay. So we'll play a small game. How will Trump deal with this issue, and how should Trump deal with this issue? And I'll say the issue, you give me the answer. So how will Trump deal with US dollar, and how should he deal with US dollar?
Trump will try to do the impossible, which is to have tariffs, to spend a lot of money, to borrow a lot of money, and still have the dollar go down because he likes the idea of the US being competitive. It's impossible to do those. You should deal with it. My view has always been the US should pursue what it regards as the best economic policy for it. The value of the dollar is a price. Whether it goes up or down is largely irrelevant, and sometimes it'll help exporters, other times it'll help importers. The US president should not worry about that. He should do what's good for the economy. The dollar will end up where supply and demand place it.
How will Trump deal with crypto, and how should he deal with crypto?
I think he should have a more benign attitude towards it, with the exception of cracking down on crime, and I suspect that he will. I think that this is an area where the Democrats, again, made a mistake. Why did they come out so strongly against crypto? There are 50 million people in America who own crypto, and they came out against it. And who is on the other side? If you think about this in political terms, what is the constituency of people saying, we need more regulations on crypto? Nobody. Most people don't care. 50 million people who own it feel one way. Why are you taking a position?
Okay. How will Trump deal with, and how should Trump deal with Iran?
He will try to exert more pressure and maximum pressure, all the things he said, which is, I think, basically the wrong approach. We already have lots of pressure on Iran. We should maintain a certain amount of that pressure. But we have to have a serious strategy towards a country. You have to also have some carrots for good behavior. You also have some, if there's a box which has 4 walls, no windows, and no doors, you give the Iranians no incentive to in some way moderate their behavior. So, that's the problem here with Iran right now. Where should it go? What is the, if you were a rational Iranian statesman, where do you have incentives to go? And the broadly speaking, the right in America, but Trump in particular, have this policy which is, kind of a fantasy that we just put this pressure on. The Iranian regime will collapse and Thomas Jefferson will rule Iran. That's not going to happen.
So what will he do and what should he do with regards Israel-Hamas?
I think that I would distinguish between what Israel is doing in the north, in Lebanon, and with Iran, where I think it's reestablishing deterrence in a very important and valuable way. The Iranians have been getting away with murder in terms of lobbing, through Hezbollah, these missiles at Israel, terrorizing the population in northern Israel. Completely unacceptable, deeply destabilizing. The Houthis are doing this in the Gulf, diverting shipping. The Israelis are doing the right thing in reestablishing deterrence and stability. I think in the occupied territories, I think he should work towards a two-state solution, which he will absolutely not do. So I suspect he'll do some version of what I'm recommending in the north, but in the occupied territories, it'll actually be the opposite. I suspect that the Israelis will de facto engage in more annexation of territory in the West Bank, making it even more unlikely that there will be a Palestinian state, which is very sad.
Do you think, sorry to break from the rapid fire, but do you think the Abraham Accords somewhere have caused all of this, that there was some peace coming around there was some long-term stability coming, and that actually caused all of the anxiety to
I don't think it caused it, but you're right to point to that, because what it did for the Israelis was make them realize something that, honestly, I've been saying for a long time. The Arabs don't really care about the Palestinians. They pretend to care about the Palestinians. And what the Abraham Accords revealed was that when they realized that it was in their self-interest to hook themselves up to Israel, which has become this technological, economic powerhouse, they couldn't give a damn about the Palestinians. And once the Israelis realized that, for them it took a lot of the pressure off in terms of having to think about a potential two-state solution. And it made the world realize, wait a minute, if the neighbors aren't that interested, maybe we don't, what pressure do we have? What leverage do we have? The Saudis at this point are the only ones who really have some real leverage. And you can tell that Saudi public opinion has really shifted because of the humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza. Because the Crown Prince began by very, very mild to no criticism of Israel after the October 7th, after the Israeli response to the October 7th terrorist attack. And then last week, he's come out and said it's a war crime, that the Israeli government should be tried as war criminals. We have to return to 67 borders with a Palestinian state with Jerusalem as its capital. He's never said all these things. And he monitors public opinion very closely. So obviously something has shifted in Saudi Arabia. And so the only person who has leverage is MBS. And he could say to the Israelis, I'll only normalize if you do something for the Palestinians. So that's the one card left.
And so what should Trump do and what will Trump do with regard to Saudi?
I think what he should do is tell the Saudis, let's make a deal with the Israelis, but let's get the Palestinians a pathway to statehood. I think he will try to make a deal with the Israelis without the pathway. He'll just say, some rhetorical gestures towards Palestinian rights, greater autonomy in the West Bank, something like that will be enough. And the Israelis would be much happier with that than anything from. So that's why, again, all the leverage lies with MBS, because, ultimately it's his decision. The danger for the Palestinians is what MBS really wants is the deal with the Americans, which Trump can deliver to him, right? So for MBS, if he gets American security guarantees, maybe he'll relax on the Palestinian issue.
Taiwan.
Will relax on the Palestinian issue.
Taiwan. What should Trump do? What will Trump do?
I think he'll follow the Biden policy, which has been very, very strong and consistent. And by broadly speaking, American policy has been the same on Taiwan, which is do everything you can to deter the Chinese, from attacking and do everything you can to deter the Taiwanese from declaring independence, because that would trigger a Chinese attack. It's a very difficult balancing act, but there's no way around it.
If Jaishankar were to come to you for advice on how...
Which he won't.
But if he were to come to you for advice on how India should deal with the following countries, what would you say? Canada?
Try to resolve it. It seems to me like there's a very narrow issue on which there is this disagreement. But that's what diplomacy is all about, is finding a way to compartmentalize that so it doesn't spill over into the broader relationship.
Iran?
Continue to have relations with Iran. I think it's in India's interest not to isolate itself, and it needs the oil.
It needs the oil. Russia?
I would continue to have relations with Russia, but I would strategically reorient India's defense and military posture away from Russian equipment, Russian training, Russian security architecture, and that still hasn't happened, as you know. I mean, India still gets, I think, 80% of its advanced weaponry from Russia.
Pakistan?
Look, I would love to see an Indo-Pakistani reconciliation, more trade, more travel between the two countries. This is one of the great tragedies of the world more cricket, exactly. It's one of the great tragedies of the world that these, two people who are really, if not brothers and sisters, at least cousins, have been separated by this, this very cruel divide. And if you just think of it in human terms, it's a real tragedy. And India is the much more powerful country. It has the capacity, it has the leeway to do something, to try to search for some kind of generous reconciliation here. I realize what I'm saying is not going to happen, but you're asking what should it do? Look, if you can end up in a world in which India and Pakistan had much greater people-to-people ties, economy-to-economy ties, sports. I think that would completely transform the subcontinent of India. And frankly, that whole issue of Pakistan becoming China's agent would be deeply compromised. It would be very difficult for even a military government in Pakistan to act in a deeply anti-Indian way, because the two peoples would be so intermingled and intertwined that it would be impossible. And I think that it's very sad the way in which the countries have been divided, the cities have been divided. I mean, Delhi and Lahore are really twin cities, and the fact that they've become, one has become essentially completely one way and the other is another way. It's a very sad thing for, my father spent his entire life wishing that there had never been a partition. I don't know if that was ever, feasible, but the one thing you can do is make these lines less important for people.
Last question, short answer, Bangladesh, after recent drama.
Yeah, it's a very tough one, and I think that the way that India should handle Bangladesh is basically to try to be less involved in Bangladesh, to let Bangladesh try to sort itself out, not take sides, not that I'm saying that it was deeply involved, but there's only downside. If you think about like US and Mexico, things like that, when you're one very big, rich country and you're one very poor, somewhat unstable country, the best thing you can do is just try to be as uninvolved, because otherwise you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. There are going to be conspiracy theories no matter what you do. And the best you can do is just try to be as disengaged as possible, work with whoever happens to be in power.
In Trump 2.0, what will happen to American big tech?
I think by and large, American big tech will continue to do fine. It is by far it has such enormous technological and economic advantages that are what is powering its rise. I think it will face some real challenges on the issue of whether or not social media is in fact a publisher of content rather than simply a platform. And on that issue, by the way, I'm sympathetic to what some people like J.D. Vance and Trump say. I think that the idea that Facebook and these groups have been able to get away by saying, you know, we have no responsibility or liability for any of the stuff that appears on here because we're just the platform, is outrageous, and maybe it was a mistake from the start. And the internet should be treated much more like the public airwaves or broadcasts or something like that, where if you're utilizing them, you have certain responsibilities in terms of the kind of content you provide. Now, the problem in America is everybody has their own definition of what good content and bad content is.
Yeah, that's part of the game. American Big Pharma. What will happen to American Big Pharma?
Well, you have Robert Kennedy, who is, you know, a completely unique new phenomenon. So I would be hesitant to predict. But my own sense, without being an expert on this issue, is that while he has some legitimate instances where it does seem as though Big Pharma has been able to influence the scientific establishment and maybe accelerate some or allow some drugs to get through without that they shouldn't have. By and large, the scientific establishment works on the basis of facts, on the basis of research, on the basis of double-blind trials, and I would hope that you would not replace that with kind of random assertions about causation, which are really all just about correlation. You know, I mean, you say, ever since we put fluoride in the water, you have a rise of autism. Well, ever since we've used cell phones, you have a rise of autism. Ever since we've used electricity, you have a rise of cancer. Correlation is not causation. And you'd hope that there would be some very detailed analysis on whether or not there is evidence that there's something in the, in the fluoride that's causing that. On the flip side, and you look at a place like Calgary in Canada, where they took the fluoride out of the water in about 10 years ago, and you've had massive increases in tooth decay among children, massive need for intravenous antibiotics that have to be given to teenage kids because of tooth diseases and things like that. So, the truth is medicine is a trade-off. Like every vaccine does have a one in a, some 10,000, 100,000 million people get sick by it, or there are side effects or there are problems. But you want to be weighing these rationally using aggregate data, not on the basis of some story you heard, about some that tells you, as I said, that there's some strange correlation here.
He was in that McDonald's photo. Where,
That's right. He was, which again is fascinating because most of the time he says he never touches junk food. This is all poison, this, that, and the other,
Trump 2.0, what will happen to Chinese EV companies?
Right now, there is already a 29% tariff on it. So I suspect that unless Chinese EV companies start selling a lot into the US, they won't raise the tariffs. But if they do, he'll raise the tariffs. So, I mean, Trump is, in his bones, he's a protectionist. Yep. That's the he took out an ad in 1985 when he was a real estate developer. And it was all about protectionism. Those are his first expressed political views, are protectionist.
What happens to the world's fight on climate crisis?
Well, it'll have to fight without America. Look, the truth is, no, I'm joking actually, because the American economy is already decarbonizing on very broad grounds. It's trying to move into solar and wind, already has. Battery technology is getting much better. EV usage, hybrids are getting much stronger. The great challenge for climate change, honestly, is China and India and Indonesia. It's not what happens in America. America is already on a fairly green path. The U.S. is using, the U.S. and Europe have managed this extraordinary thing, which is that they are growing economically without adding to their carbon emissions. Their carbon emissions are essentially have plateaued. The rise in carbon emissions is largely taking place in the developing world. And it is coming out of the dirtiest of all fossil fuels, which is coal. Yeah. So the real challenge for climate change is, can you come up with a green technology that is cheaper than coal? If you had a magic wand, that's what you're looking for. Because if you can't find something and it needs to be zero carbon emissions. So unless you can find something that's zero carbon emissions, you're not helping the environment. And unless it's cheaper than coal, it's not going to get adopted in poor countries. So that's the magic formula. I don't think Trump's policies change that much.
Okay, the world is a better place game. So how many years or months before we see these headlines actually appear? Headline number 1, Zelensky, Putin declares ceasefire.
Possible within 6 months.
Okay. Modi, Xi Jinping reach an agreement on border.
I think that is likely harder largely because of the Chinese. The Chinese have some neuralgic attitude towards that border. They've solved 15 of the 16 border disputes they have with their neighbors. This is the only border dispute they have not solved. And I think it's because it involves, in their conception, Greater Tibet, which for them is caught up with their sense of China as a nation, being, and Tibet, Mongolia, Taiwan, all being part of it. So I think it's on the Chinese side, and therefore I think it's probably less likely, not in the next year.
Okay. Israel and Iran sit down for peace talks.
No chance.
Israel accepts a two-state solution.
5% chance.
Okay.
I mean, by two-state solution, I mean an actual state.
Yes.
5% chance.
Okay. You get the following guests on GPS. What's the most important question you'd put to each one of them? Narendra Modi.
I would ask him what he thinks, how he thinks what is the best way to strengthen and let flourish India's deeply pluralistic nature. The fact that it is a country composed of so many castes, tribes, religions, ethnicities, languages, is the best way to have a single model that people have to aspire towards and all integrate towards? Or is it better to let live and let live? And is he following policies that really allow that pluralism to flourish?
Rahul Gandhi?
Is there a way for the Congress Party to go back to being a genuine grassroots organization the way it was before internal party elections were suspended in wherever it was, 1971? Because that to me was the great change in the Congress. It went from being a grassroots organization to a court. And I don't think it has ever really found its way back to being that grassroots organization that Gandhi built.
That's a great answer. Kamala Harris.
Why didn't you go on Joe Rogan? And why didn't you, why didn't you, honestly, why didn't you find a way to let people see the authentic you? Because politics has changed. People want authenticity. They don't care about 30-second commercials, good lighting, good audio, good video. They want to see the real you. And if that, and if that means sitting down for a 2-hour podcast, if that means, doing videos off your phone, it's a very interesting shift that the Republicans actually figured out that the Democrats didn't.
Biden?
Why in God's name did you not why did you not fulfill the promise, the implicit promise you made to the American people, which was that you would be a one-term president and you would step down and let there be an open Democratic primary, which would have allowed for the strongest Democratic candidate to emerge?
Super, great answer. Netanyahu.
Why don't you want to go down in history as like Nixon did with the opening to China, as the hawk who was able to secure Israel's future by taking the one albatross that it has off its neck and allowing for a Palestinian state?
Putin.
Oh, gosh. Are you really the richest man in the world, as I think Elon Musk once said?
Xi Jinping.
Xi Jinping, I think the most interesting question for Xi Jinping is, do you believe it is possible for China to have an open, dynamic, bottom-up, individually based economy and a Leninist political system at the same time? Because that's what he's trying to do. And, it seems to me you're trying to do the impossible.
Okay, lovely. completely different direction. The one thing that you think has improved about Mumbai since you were in cathedral school, which where I also was, and the one thing that's gotten worse.
Well, I can say this now because I have just, because I've come after a year. The roads in Mumbai with this under the tunnel and the new sea link, dramatically better than when I grew up. Look, I grew up. You always have a nostalgia about your youth. I think that the kind of I'm looking at my sister here. And so I'm going to pander to her. The lack of attention to preserving Bombay's architectural heritage seems to me a huge tragedy. If you go to Singapore, they've managed to preserve their little hutments and these little chawls that they had and stuff. And Singapore was like was a fueling station on the British Raj. Bombay was the jewel in the crown. And if you look at Ballard Estate and Fort and Colaba, those expressions of Indo-Anglo, Indo-Saracen architecture are the greatest expressions of that architecture in the world. I mean, VT, whatever it's called now, is really one of the most extraordinary buildings in the world. And the way in which we have not preserved all that is really so tragic. I mean, if you look at, the Marine Drive, the way they've allowed all these Art Deco buildings to be altered, defaced, destroyed. And if you look at Miami, and this is America, land of the future, land of destruction, they are perfectly preserved because they are all heritage. Actually, Marine Drive has a more impressive collection of Art Deco buildings than Miami does. But you'd never know it now because, everybody's added a little chatti here and a glass here and a, thing there. And somehow it's all been allowed.
Yeah, super. Okay, we got a few questions. Yes. Okay, a lot of hands here. So we'll take a couple at a time. Fareed, is that okay? Yeah?
Of course.
Can we start? I had promised Dharmil Bodani the first question. Yeah. Hi.
Hello. Hi, thank you. Thank you, Anand. Hi, Fareed. I think you're one of the more incisive and knowledgeable commentators I've followed over the years. And I feel it's evident that you've been anti-Trump. Now that he has won the presidency, the Senate, the House, the Electoral College, and the popular vote, how do you view your role going forward? Will you continue to be a strong critic, villainizing Trump? Or will you spend some time trying to bridge the divide between the leftists who follow you, and those who voted for Trump?
Well, I actually have a pretty broad following that's bipartisan. That if you look at my audience, and in the first Trump term, I many times supported things Trump did. In fact, I once wrote a column about why people should not succumb to Trump derangement syndrome (TDS). But I don't start out from the position that everything Trump does is bad at all. I think that I've always tried to evaluate every policy on its own terms and decide whether or not that policy, in my opinion, makes sense for the United States, for the world, and I'll continue to do that. Some of the things he said rhetorically, I've worried about a lot. Some of the things, as I pointed out, that he said rhetorically, I support. But I'm not going to do it, the implication of your question, I'm not going to do it because he won the popular vote in the United States by 1.5%. In my way of thinking, truth is not a popularity contest. The fact that he has a slight majority of Americans who voted in his favor does not mean that if he says, I would like to abolish the rule of law in America and have, Matt Gaetz become my attorney general, it becomes virtue. I still think that there are independent criteria by which you measure the value of public policy, the virtue of public policy, and your own morality, other than by a popularity contest.
Radha, then we get Mr. Bajaj here, and then Mr. Shah. Yeah, please. Yes. Yes. Okay.
I love this. This is pure Bombay.
Go ahead.
Hi, I had a hypothetical question. If Biden hadn't resigned, would the election result, in your opinion, have been different?
It's a good question. So if you look over the last year, this is the first time in 120 years that every incumbent party in the advanced world, in the rich countries, lost. And they lost by huge margins. You know, the Conservatives lost in Britain. They had their largest majority since Margaret Thatcher, and it went to their smallest minority in 200 years. If you look at Macron's party in France, it got destroyed. If you look at the Dutch, they got destroyed. The Japanese LDP, which has ruled Japan since 1948, uninterrupted, lost. So if you think about it in those terms, there was clearly a kind of incumbent penalty that every ruling party was facing. Obviously, even Modi experienced an incumbent penalty. So I think that the chance for Democrats was slimmer than people realize, but given how close the election was, and it really was quite close, 1.5%, yes, I do think that if you had had a different Democrat, you had a chance, because fundamentally the election is about insiders versus outsiders. You know, if you think about the mood we are in, the two political figures who have dominated America for the last 20 years are Barack Obama and Donald Trump. What do they both have in common? Just one thing: they're both outsiders. So if the Democrats had nominated somebody who could plausibly say, I'm an outsider. I don't come from the Trump administration. I don't come from the Biden administration. I'm this person in Michigan who was doing her own thing. If it was Gretchen Whitmer, the governor of Michigan, maybe. But it was a tough one.
No, so considering it was just Biden, not anyone else.
Oh, no, Biden would have lost in a landslide. Okay. I think Biden, because the prospect of Biden having a second moment like the debate was very high. And if he had had that, he was losing in the polls by, if you assume that polls always get Trump wrong by a little, which seems to be now, we've had 3 polls, 3 elections, they always underestimate his support. So let's add 2% to Trump's margin. Trump was beating Biden by 5 points, which means he would have won by 7 points.
Mr. Bajaj?
Fareed, you must know that every Sunday evening I spend with you via the television. And so it's a great chance to see you in person.
Thank you so much.
As you know, the Supreme Court gave immunity to the President of America. However, now there are voices which are being raised as it being unconstitutional, including the lady judge. And the others are also slowly putting their voices up because they feel it's dangerous to have a person like Trump have invincibility. If they're able to succeed and he doesn't get invincibility, otherwise he'll just throw away all his cases. Do you think there is a chance of him being disqualified as the President of America?
No, 0 chance. Because remember, the Supreme Court has already ruled. What you're referring to is one of the justices who was in a minority is saying, you know, she thinks that it was an incorrect ruling. Well, but that's fine. But if she was in a minority, the majority has already ruled, that ruling will hold. And by the way, the ruling was not as broad as it's sometimes reported as. The ruling said that as president, in his official capacity, the president has broad immunity in most areas. It does not say in every area. So it would allow for a court challenge if he did something. But I think I don't agree with the ruling. I think it was too broad. But it was trying to cover, the idea is he orders a airstrike on something and, American civilians die or something. Can he be sued? Or can he be taken to task for murder? And so there was an effort to essentially create a kind of cover of immunity for the official acts as president. It's left unclear what it means to have unofficial acts. But look, until the Supreme Court reverses itself, that ruling holds whatever the minority may feel.
Go ahead, please. We'll take 2 at a time if you don't mind.
Sure, sorry. Yeah.
In a free and fair election, knowing everything that the American people do about Donald Trump and all the people who spoke who were close to him and worked with him on January 6th, they still elected him. What does it say about America And do you, I mean, while you've expressed 2 or 3 times just now, the American institutions are strong, do you really believe it, considering all the wrecking balls that are being put in right from the White House to every single department?
Take Mr. Jain's question also.
Just a quick one, Fareed. Firstly, I completely share your view on character scoring of a policy. There's no two of it. Still, like Rajesh said, still so many Americans voted for him. My question is, you said Trump is protectionist. He's close to Modi, who's in the opposite direction. Do you think there can be an alignment on protectionism between India and the US?
I'll answer your question first.
Okay,
On India and the US, yes, they can cut a trade deal. I don't think you'll ever convince Trump that tariffs are a bad idea. Trump is deeply convinced in his own worldview in that regard. On the question you were asking about you know, kind of the democratic checks and balances in the US. Look, I worry, of course I worry, but I do think that there are so many institutions in America. You would need to have, you know, the bureaucracies completely cave. You would have to have the courts completely cave. You'd have to have state and local governments completely cave. You'd have to have the army completely agree to, you know, get politicized. The US has so many different areas where there will be pushback that, at least that's my hope, that you will see a much, much more complicated environment. Then, you know, even things like this where he says we're going to hire half the federal bureaucracy. Well, it's much harder than you think. I mean, these are often, Congress has to do that. You can't just, you know, what do you do with congressional funds that have been appropriated that you're not going to spend? I mean, are you going to, what do you do with these, many of them are protected jobs under civil service laws. There are union contracts. Are those contracts going to be upheld in courts, you know? So you can say these things, but when, let's see what happens when you actually have to start implementing these things. Now, there are some areas where he will be able to dismiss the cases against him at the federal level, but not at the state level. State cases continue, and they may just suspend them for the period of time he's president. But, you know, the U.S. has many, many checks.
I have a question. Good afternoon. I'm Vandana Shah. I'm a divorce lawyer and an author. I'm your avid fan. And my question is about women's rights. No one has asked that at all over here. What happens, you know, Roe versus Wade is overturned. And what will happen, A, to women's reproductive rights? And B, are we going to go back to almost zero feminism? Will the likes of Gloria Steinem not have voices anymore? And as she writes in her book, as if women matter. And, you know, I see that because there was not a single question regarding what are women's rights, how are those going to go under Trump? And a funny one, will Manalia really be a part-time White House wife, or, you know, will she be a full-time and she'll continue in Trump Towers? That's my question. That's why I was really, like, you know, hankering to ask the question, because I wanted to hear your view on it. Thank you.
We'll take a second one also there. Yes, please. Mr. Lalwani sitting in the back also. We'll get a mic too. Yes, go ahead. It's on.
Anand, thank you. Thank you very much, Anandji, for everything. Fareed, a very important question about your perspective on the federal debt of 35 trillion, which Trump has to handle the fireball. Your personal take on this. Thank you.
Sure. Why don't I do the women first and then the debt? So Kamala Harris made a bet, actually, that the two issues that would matter to the American people were democracy and Dobbs. Dobbs being the ruling that overturned Roe v. Wade. And it honestly basically turned out not to be true. That two possible reasons. One, I think people felt that, you know, it's hard to make the case that he's going to be a dictator. He was president once. And, you know, I'm now just telling you how I think some people thought. Look, he was president once, and he did leave office. Yeah, he went kicking and screaming, but he did leave, you know, so there wasn't, you know, you can't really make the dictator charge stick. And on Dobbs, I wonder whether people were being actually somewhat intelligent, which is, what did Roe v. Wade do? It returned the issue to the states. So there isn't a federal role unless the federal government passes an abortion ban, which Trump said he would be against and would veto. So Trump also played the abortion issue very cleverly by taking it off the agenda. And, I mean, maybe it's not surprising, women are intelligent. They were like, because in state elections, they all voted pro-choice, for the pro-choice candidate, for pro-choice, initiatives and referenda. But in this case, maybe they were not as motivated because they realized it doesn't change very much. But I think there is a broader issue which you raised, which is look, when we talk about this world of backlash, there's no question that a very core part of this backlash is a backlash to feminism and to the emancipation of women. Look, think about it. What is the broadest societal change that has taken place in the Western world in the last 50 years? It's the emancipation of women, by far, beyond anything else. Because, you talk about civil rights. Look, for all of human history, some group has been on top and some group has been on the bottom. And the group on top discriminates against the group on the bottom. That's the history of, tribes or forever. But through that whole period, one group has always been second-class citizens in every society, and that's women. And that began to change over the last 50 years. And I think in the Western world, it has substantially changed. And what you did was you took the most fundamental social unit in society, the family, and you changed the power dynamic within it, going from hierarchical to egalitarian. And as it should, of course, have been. But it's provoking a response. It's provoking a reaction. And I think you're seeing, because people don't know how to express it and articulate it. But everywhere in the world, you look at these right-wing movements, whether it's Islamic fundamentalism, whether it's the Haredi in Israel, the ultra-Orthodox, Christian nationalism, their number one agenda is a restoration of traditional roles for men and women. The feeling that it's all gone too far. It's all kind of gotten out of hand. We have to, and I think in some ways, the election showed this. I tell you the most depressing statistic along those lines. Joe Biden got a larger share of the female vote in the United States than Kamala Harris or Hillary Clinton. So, the old white guy got more women to vote for him. So it gets back to that issue I was talking about working women and non-working women. So, yeah, it's a sobering reality that it's a huge fundamental change, and I don't think society anywhere has digested it properly. And I say that with a certain degree of apprehension because I have two daughters, and I think that you want to think that it's all going to be much, much easier for them, but I think not. I think it's still a struggle. It's a struggle. On the debt, I have a somewhat contrarian view on the debt, which is the United States is the world's leading economic power. It's the richest country in the world. It is leading in technology on a scale that no country really has ever led. If you think about the top 10 technology companies in the world are all American. That's never been true in the last 50 years. There were always Japanese companies, German companies, Dutch companies, nothing. It's all American companies. One American company, NVIDIA, is now worth twice the entire German stock exchange, to give you a sense of the scale of the dominance. Now, and the dollar is the reserve currency of the world. And the American financial system is the most important financial system in the world. In that context, how much debt can the U.S. bear? I remember when Japan went over 100% of GDP. Everyone said this is going to be collapse. It's going to be a crisis. The Japanese, it's all over. Japan is now at 240% debt to GDP ratio. It's going on fine. I mean, it's growing slowly, but no crisis, no collapse. Why? Because it's all debt in their own currency. They control it. A lot of it they owe to themselves. I don't know what the right number for U.S. debt is. So the U.S. debt is, I think, now 90% of GDP or something like that. Is it 100, 120, is it 140? You could argue if Japan can carry 240% GDP debt, the US should be able to carry 300% because it's much stronger, it's much more powerful, it's much stronger time horizon. The danger is the interest payments on the debt, which crowd out all other spending, which, then you have to, you're very sensitive to interest rate rises and falls. And so I worry about it, but I guess I don't think there's going to be a crisis. I don't think there's any danger of a collapse.
Okay, I think 2 more questions. This gentleman here is very keen, and then Mr. Lalwani, please. Yeah.
Should I go?
Go ahead.
Thank you. Great conversation. Thank you so much. Fareed, my question is to all three of you. For the first time in the last 36 years, the Washington Post did not endorse or refrain from endorsing a US presidential candidate. And we also know, and you talked about it, that the social media influence on voting population is increasing. Given this scenario landscape, what should reputed publications like the Washington Post or the Indian Express do to restore the confidence on voting rights in democracies like ours?
It's a broader question that I think is a very challenging one, because something interesting has happened. People often talk about how there's been a kind of a collapse of trust, but it's not a collapse of trust in everybody. It's a collapse of trust in established institutions, like the Washington Post. But if you look at America, so there's been a collapse of trust in the Centers for Disease Control or the National Institute of Health. But there's a huge rise of trust in a podcaster named Huberman, right? And a podcaster named Peter Attia, and Robert Kennedy. So it's not a decline in trust, it's a shift of trust from an institution to an individual. And I think that leaves you wondering what should those institutions do to regain trust. And I think there's a larger problem, which is that people want much greater transparency. What does it mean when you say the Washington Post endorses a presidential candidate? Who is endorsing the presidential candidate? Is it Jeff Bezos, the owner? Is it the editorial page editor? Who's a guy named David Shipley? Was there a vote taken among the columnists of the Post, which I'm one? No. Was it an editorial? Whereas when Joe Rogan says, I like Donald Trump and I'm going to vote for him, that's purely transparent. You know the guy, you've watched him for hours, and he's saying, I like Trump. So I think there's a problem here for institutions. And we're living in an age of much greater disaggregation, transparency, and authenticity. And institutions come across as inauthentic. And so I don't know what the best way to handle that is. I would say that the better thing to do for a place like the Washington Post or the Express is have 10 people write editorials, and let people see, open the hood. Let people say, when you say the Express feels this way, who are those people? What did they think? Why do they think that? And people can then listen and say, oh, there's a debate among the Express, and I like this guy, I didn't like this guy. I don't think you can any longer say, the Indian Express or the Washington Post, has this view. And I wonder about that for even the CDC and all the NIH. Maybe they need to be more open and transparent. I think one of the problems with COVID was that people didn't understand what is the scientific basis on which you're saying one day masks are good, one day masks are bad, one day you should you're shutting down schools even though children don't seem to be getting the disease. And if you'd had an open discussion, here are the pieces of evidence we're looking at. We don't know a lot, we're collecting data, but on the basis of this set of 6 pieces of data, this is why we think this. I think maybe that's the way you restore trust.
I'll just do a quick response because a little bit I kind of disagree with Fareed a little bit on this, and I guess I have to because we're in of the position that we both hold. But every podcaster that there is a lot of trust for, Fareed, 3 years, 5 years at best is their product life cycle. They immediately lose trust. They accidentally will wear a green shirt and show up talking about Palestine, and suddenly everybody's lost trust. I mean, it is so fickle. It is so fickle. So trust is fickle, and especially if you put a human face to it, it's impossible for any human being. I think one single human being, you're one of the exceptions, but it's very difficult for one human being to withstand all that scrutiny for a long period of time. I think at some point,
that's a very good point.
And so I think institutions institutions have to be a big umbrella of many individuals.
How did they build more trust?
The individuals or the institutions?
The institutions.
Have many individuals under that umbrella of, you have many ideally, and you cannot have Joe Rogan working for one institution, but ideally build many, and I must tell you, legacy media in India has seen a bump after COVID. After the infodemic, it all came because, there are 4,500 newspapers here. There are 500 news channels. There are, I don't know, there are 150,000 registered publications. There are, I don't know how many news websites. It is the legacy, the brand, the people who said, look, we are Dainik Bhaskar, we are Indian Express, we are Times of India, Hindustan Times. There was a demand came for trust, credibility, authenticity, for the old legacy. I felt that in India. I think most of my peers also did. But anyway, but you're right.
So it's a very good point.
Yes, please.
So, Dr. Zakaria,
Okay, one last question. Any women?
You got to let Suhail, because Suhail is my lawyer and he'll get very angry with me.
Okay, great.
Absolutely. Right after this. So, Dr. Zakaria, you shaped worldviews, and what you say matters. As somebody who is straddling both sides and technology, outsourcing, doubling down on AI, we're really scared about what arbitrary Trump decision-making and tariffs does to the industry as a whole. The backdrop to that question is that part of the post-liberalization IT generation inspired by the West Wing, American largesse, Dr. Zakaria perhaps becoming Secretary of State, haven't given up on that yet, by the way. And now we find the sharper elbows, the negotiations. We're heavily invested. I live in both sides of the Atlantic, both like metaphorically and business-wise. How do $250 billion plus of exports of IT and services and GCCs and so on stand up, prepare? Do we double down? Do we take a guarded approach? Give us an unguarded, I guess, your own thought, because we've shaped our careers around this. Would love to know what we do now. We're a little scared.
Should we take a second as well?
Yeah, so being a lawyer, Fareed, I have to ask a legal question. At the start of this, you made a point that these are now strongman kind of democracies, illiberal democracies. We have a Supreme Court which was essentially created by Trump, and in a US Supreme Court, there is no retirement age. So you're going to see this for decades. We've lived through this once in India during emergency, but now we have courts in India which will now be stacked in a particular manner for probably decades as well. Does this mean that the third leg of democracy is now dead for the foreseeable future, or the courts still will have any role to play because the way they've been stacked and treated now in two of the largest democracies in the world?
Look, I worry a lot about what you're saying, but maybe in a sense one has to recognize that what that reflects is, the United States is a right-of-center country, I think, broadly speaking. And over the last 30 or 40 years, if you think about since Nixon, the courts now reflect that right-of-center orientation, just as after Franklin Roosevelt, for about 50 years, the courts reflected a left-of-center orientation, really up to about the late 70s. Early 80s, the courts were largely liberal. Even the justices appointed by conservatives ended up being kind of left of center. Roe v. Wade was a decision under the Nixon court. So at some level, where there's almost like a period of dominance in one area or the other. And what I try to console myself, I think to myself, imagine having been, a kind of hardcore free market Republican in the 1930s. You watched the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, when Eisenhower was basically Roosevelt's favorite general, pretended to be a Republican. And it wasn't until 1968 that you get Nixon. It's really the first right-of-center government since 1932, right? So there are these long swings, and you're right about it. And what you hope is that some of these people, you know this well because you represent that idea, those ideas so well, that these people think of themselves as officers of the court, that there is a greater public service that they have to provide, that they can't be purely partisan, that they have some integrity around these ideas. And you can have differing judicial interpretations, but you don't slavishly just do what one side or the other wants. And it varies, place to place, but it is the great, it's the great worry about democracy, because this was it's not just the third stool, but it's the final stool. It's the one that ultimately has the ability to undo, only one that has the ability to undo other things. Now, I'll say one final thing, which is, let's not have a too romantic view of what it was like in the old days. You know, I mean, yes, one judge in Allahabad ruled against Indira Gandhi. I would say that was not the norm in the 1970s. The judges were not as brave as that. So there was, you know, it was not as though India was a proud exemplar of hardcore judicial independence before, but it was getting better. I mean, that's the tragedy. You know, there was an upward trajectory, both in the US, and by the way, the same is true in the US. If you think about things like Federal Reserve independence, judicial independence, corruption, things like that, these, you know, the 1950s in America, there was plenty of corruption, but it was all getting better. And again, had particularly gotten better these last 30 years, and then it went astray. On your point, look, I think that India is going to be fine, because the US has a special relationship with India, not just at the governmental level because of China, but because businesses love India, because there are so many Indian Americans, that creates its own corridor. So I think it may not be because all the trends are going in the way that you would like them to go more generally. India may be able to get some special dispensation and special exemptions, but I think you'll be fine, and you should feel completely comfortable in your corridor. I don't know about, you know, whether everywhere else will be fine.
Well, your time for last question?
Sure.
Can we get a women, any women? I wanted to do a little affirmative action here also. Yes, please, Natasha. I'll give you.
Hi, thank you. Very insightful conversation. But the general theme seems to be that you are very optimistic about the US. Whether they're entering wars, exiting wars, the economy, you would in fact think one of India's mistakes is not aligning themselves with the US more. Do you at all anticipate a new world order or a different world order? Or is there anything that America can do that shoots itself in the foot?
Yeah, I mean, you're basically right. First of all, I'm temperamentally an optimist. I think in life, people who sit and, you know, have these dour pessimistic views, they don't get anything done, you know. Nobody started a business because they were the deeply pessimistic, you know, gloomy person. You know, Samir is going to start a new restaurant because he's optimistic about Bombay Canteen's prospects and Sweet Shop's prospects, and it's all going, and his optimism has been borne out. So, by the way, if you haven't been, you absolutely have to.
We just need to help get table.
The thing that I worry most about is an American withdrawal from the world. Because if America withdraws from the world, you have more chaos, you have more erosion of all these things. And I'm not looking at the world through rosy-colored glasses. I know that America has made lots of mistakes. I know that Vietnam, Iraq, you can look at all kinds of things. But what I'm saying is, you know, sometimes in life you can only be, you know, what does Biden say? Don't compare me to the Almighty, compare me to the alternative. You know, would the world have been better if the Soviet Union had won the Cold War? Would the world have been better if the Axis powers had won World War II? Would the world have been better if Germany had won World War I rather than the democracies, Britain, France, and the US? You know, so compared to the alternative scenarios, you're always going to have some dominant power, and that dominant power is going to have extraordinary influence in the world, politically, militarily, economically, and culturally. Given that reality, I'd rather live in a world that was shaped by American power than by Chinese power, which is really the alternative today. And so in that context, what I worry about is the collapse of America and the withdrawal of America, because the truth is, America doesn't need the world. It's got huge internal economy. It has enormous vitality. It has enormous creativity. The world, in a sense, needs America more than America needs the world. And so one of the reasons I do what I do is to try to keep Americans engaged in the world and make them understand that there's a value to being involved and you know, that it's part of America's sort of historical mission in the world. But, you know, it's a harder sell today than it was 10 years ago.
Short last question here, please. Then we can, yes.
I'm Colonel Anil Bhatt, retired. will there be any change in the, it was in Canada, whatever was happening, and US supporting, maybe partially, but it did. There. Then the step up in terrorism in Kashmir by Pakistan Army, because abrogation won, elections, and thirdly, Bangladesh. Will Trump make a difference in all these three?
I don't really think so. I think Trump's attitude will be to let the Indians do what they want. I think that it's largely going to be, you sort these things out, you do whatever you want. He likes Modi. He's going to give Modi a free rein. And I think these are not fundamental challenges that India will not be able to face. I think that, you can get overly excited about, an incident here, an incident there. But broadly speaking, India is living in, a greater degree of regional stability than it has in a long time. I mean, if you think back to all the cross-border terrorism that used to take place, if you think back to the Bangladesh war, if you think back, it's broadly speaking, India's, this is India's moment. What it should really do is figure out how do you develop your economy, how do you integrate with the world economy so that you can lift Indians out of poverty. I mean, it's still, everybody talks about India in these glittering, glowing terms, but it's really important to remember, you're still talking about hundreds and hundreds of millions of people who live under the poverty line.
No doubt.
And it should be the goal, above all, that cuts across everything else, is how do you help these people move up? How do you help them? You go to rural India, and because of Aurangabad, I've had the opportunity. There's still people living in medieval poverty in those places. And, that should be something that stirs people more in India to get, to change that, transform the shape. And I think that's one of the reasons I feel it's so important that India develop a better relationship with the United States.
Fareed, thank you so much. You've been so generous with your time. Sorry to those who didn't get the question. I'll end with the last question, Fareed. In all of this, Modi, Jaishankar, how do you rate their performance?
Please remain seated.
In foreign policy, they've basically done a pretty good job with the caveat that I said. I would prefer different strategic vision, but tactically they're very shrewd and very capable.
Okay, super. Thank you. Thank you all so much.
May I request everyone to please remain seated. May I now invite Raj Kamal Jha, Chief Editor, The Indian Express, to present a token of appreciation. This is the first page of Indian Express Delhi edition dated 20th January 1964, which happens to be Mr. Zakaria's birth date. As we conclude, I would like to thank our partners, presenting partner Religare Enterprises Limited, associate partner Strangers and Sons, experienced partner Jolie's Club. Please stay back and join us for snacks and cocktails at Big Top Bar.